Hello, welcome to Wheat from the Chaff on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm ffinlo Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Joe Stanley, writer and head of sustainable farming at the GWCT Allerton Project.
And this time we're joined by Nikki Yoxall throughout the programme and by Rhys Evans from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, who's going to be joining us briefly, and hopefully, he's not quite joined us yet, but he will be here at any moment, we're hoping, from the Royal Welsh Show to talk about what's been happening in Wales. But before we get cracking, I just want to big up two of our recent podcasts, in case you've not already heard them. In Farmgate Leaders, I talked to the magnificent John Kemp, and we discuss not only John's life in regen, but how the Amish faith shapes his world and what he really thinks of Trump and Bobby Kennedy and Maha, the Make America Healthy Again movement. And then in our most recent Farmgate, we discuss net zero and whether, in terms of land use at least, we need to move on and find more powerful and nuanced policy tools to address the crises in nature, farming and rural society. So Joe, shall we get cracking? I just wonder if you could sort of set us up with what's been happening in Wales. Our headline ran, Welsh Government unveils new partnership between farmers and nature.
Well, they've certainly been having more grass growing than we have in England. But other than that, I think on the policy side, look, obviously, we left the European Union. All four nations started to develop their own agricultural policies because agriculture is a devolved matter. Now, for the last sort of 6 to 8 years, England has kind of raced ahead in that sense, right? We've developed the Environmental Land Management Scheme, we've developed SFI, and it seemed that the other three nations of the UK were kind of lagging behind in that transition. They were still very much largely, if not entirely, retaining the old Common Agricultural Policy payments system. Now, of course, in England, all of a sudden, the brakes have been slammed on. We've got no idea where we are, what we're doing, what's going to come back in a few months' time. And now it's starting to look like actually, potentially, the other nations kind of, perhaps made the right choice in taking a slower approach to that transition. I'd be interested to hear what Nikki might have to say about that, especially around Scotland. But in Wales, they've had three major consultations around the SFS, the Sustainable Farming Scheme. Last year especially, however, there were wide-scale protests and demonstrations around, what the Welsh Government had planned for their landscape. However, the Welsh Government has announced in recent weeks that they are launching this scheme from January 2026, a new relationship between the people of Wales and our farmers. Now, there's lots of question marks still around that, and ultimately it's not as ambitious a scheme in terms of what they might be expecting to achieve in terms of environmental outcomes as the English scheme has been to date. But again, it does seem that they've kind of taken that slower approach. Certainly the Welsh farming groups are much happier now than they were 12 months ago with the outline of the scheme. A lot of details still to be filled in. But yeah, it'll be interesting to hear what Rhys has to say, from over the border.
Just before we go to Rhys, who's obviously still not quite managed to find a Wi-Fi signal at the Royal Welsh, I just wonder, Nikki, if you could sort of answer that question that Joe raised about the approaches to that sort of post-Brexit policy in terms of farming. Has the slower approach benefited Wales? But really, you're in Scotland. Do you think it's benefiting decisions that are being taken in Scotland?
I'm not sure it's benefiting in terms of meeting our climate and nature targets, but it definitely means that farmers feel a little bit more secure in what's going on. There had been frustrations as we've been going through the last sort of 3-4 years that farmers and crofters were saying they didn't know what was happening. They knew change was coming. And I think because they saw the speed of change south of the border, that they assumed lots of decisions must have been happening behind closed doors and they weren't being told about it. But actually, that wasn't the case. There was just a lot of very kind of slow moving decision making that was happening throughout Scottish Government, throughout those individuals tasked with developing the policy. And I think it's important to remember that we've never had to do this before. The policy development, none of the people working in our governments really have ever had to kind of build from the ground up agriculture policy, because we've been able to rely on Europe, and people that were involved with any of that policy development prior to that, most of them have retired by now. So it's a very new, complex, difficult piece of work for individuals to undertake. And obviously there are many competing voices and factors in the lobbying circle around government, whether that's Westminster, Holyrood, or Welsh government, or in Northern Ireland. So I think that we recognise that it's been very difficult. There have been frustrations in Scotland for sure, that there has been very much a sense of business as usual continuing, in that farmers are still getting paid on a regional basis. The bigger landowners are getting the greater payment checks, that the basic payment scheme is being retained. The hope for a tiered scheme where you only get 50% of your initial payment as base, and then another 50% is dependent and conditional on undertaking particular activities. The watering down of some of those activities has become increasingly frustrating, and much of that is related back to how the capacity of the existing computer systems to allow for changes to happen. So there's lots of technical aspects that require significant funding, and the money just isn't there to do that, in addition to paying for the new development. So yeah, I think we're going to get on and talk a little bit about the upcoming capital scheme later on, but I think in terms of the speed and the pace, it would have been great to see more happening, but actually at least farmers feel like there is a little bit of consistency, and they can at least plan ahead, because they're pretty confident the rug isn't going to be pulled out from underneath them, as they have potentially felt that they've seen south of the border.
Fantastic. Well done, Nikki, for filling that time while we were waiting for Rhys to
just as Rhys arrived
to join us. That couldn't have been better timed. Rhys, are you with us now?
I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. We can hear you. Now, Rhys, we've been talking about the difference in approaches between England and Wales and Scotland in the sort of post-Brexit farming policy landscape and nature policy landscape. And Joe sets us up to talk about the sustainable farming scheme earlier on, just before you join us, and sort of introduce the fact that, of course, there had been conflict between farmers and Welsh government in the past, but that some of that at least had been resolved at this stage. So I just wonder if I could sort of hand over to you to an extent to talk a bit about it. And the way I want to set that up is that the Deputy First Minister with responsibility for climate change and rural affairs, Hugh Aranka-Davies, has said this scheme is the product of extensive collaboration. We've listened carefully to farmers across Wales and revised our approach to ensure it works for the agricultural industry and meets our shared responsibilities to the natural world around us. So 3 questions. Has he listened? What are the key components? And what's changed from a year ago?
I think, the Deputy First Minister has listened. There's been extensive meetings and discussions over the last year. I think the progress over the last year is to be welcomed, really. And what has changed? Not a whole lot. The 10% tree requirement that dominated the discussions 12 months ago at the Royal Welsh Show, that has been scrapped and replaced with the requirement for every farmer to now develop a tree and hedgerow creation opportunity plan. So that's the biggest change, and I think from the industry's point of view, that's a welcome change. So provided that is supported by advice and guidance, and ensure that we're planting the right tree in the right place, coupled with the support to get trees into the ground, then that's a really positive step. But
so that's a change from a prescriptive requirement for a particular amount of land to be taken out of production, perhaps, and put into tree and hedge cover. It's changed to farmers taking responsibility for that for themselves and putting in place a tree management plan. And is that tree management plan going to be part of the conditions for entry to the SFS?
Yes, that's one of the 12 actions that farmers must undertake in order to get into the SFS. And I would disagree with the notion of taking land out of production to plant trees. Ideally, you integrate them, sort of hedgerows, wood pasture, agroforestry. It's not a choice, in my opinion, of planting trees or having trees and producing food. If we can integrate them together in the farm landscape, that's the main thing.
And what are the other components? You talked about there being 12. I'm not asking you to list all 12 of them.
No, that's fine.
What is it that farmers are being asked to do to get the money?
Yeah. So from our point of view, from the Nature Friendly Farming Network's point of view, there's some really good stuff in there. So that sets the baseline, if you like, for sustainability across the board. So stuff like animal health and welfare planning with your vet, soil health testing, integrated parasite and pesticide management. And one of the scheme requirements, for example, is to have 10% habitat on the farm as well. And when we talk about habitat, it's often being interpreted as almost like a rewilding element of the scheme, where you sort of fence and forget, and there's no grazing or active management involved. But that's far from true. What we're talking about here is stuff like hay meadows, lots of different types of grasslands, most upland habitats actually, be it Freed, which is that sort of unique Welsh habitat between the enclosed fields and your open mountain. You're talking about sort of heather moorland, bog, etc. And all these habitats, they've coexisted with farming. Actually, not coexisted. Farming has actually created those habitats. So they're really integral components of food production in Wales. And that's something that we really welcome.
And that's something that we're going to come back to with a different story a bit later in the programme as well. But it is that idea that, rather than just sort of talking in terms of 10 or 20% of farms being, as you say, sort of rewilded or set aside for nature, it's a recognition that actually soil and everything that grows from it is the most important habitat that exists. And therefore, we ought to be looking at delivering nature improvements across 100% of the farm rather than just simply in pockets here and there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at nature-friendly farming. I think it's those things that you can do here and there across the farm. It may be, planting hedgerows, creating a pond, buffer strips, riparian corridors. And then you almost delving into the sort of more systems approach where you maybe are looking at your stocking rates. Are you overstocked? Your grazing management, sort of moving potentially from set stocking to more sort of graze and rest approach, looking at your fertilizer use, chemical use, imported feed, and that's an element, hopefully that will be encouraged by the scheme, because there's this universal layer that every farmer must undertake these 12 actions to get the payment, but there's also an optional and collaborative element as well. So for those farmers who want to go above and beyond what's required of that baseline, there will be support to do that as well. But the biggest announcement really at the Royal Welsh Show this week has been the payment rates. So farmers have been kind of operating in the dark, really. We've got the scheme detail, but none of the financial information to complement that. So now we've got the payment methodology for that universal layer. I think we're in a better place. So just to sort of outline what that is, every farmer will receive £69 per hectare for the habitat they have on the farm, £62 for their existing woodland. Then there'll be £70 per hectare for the first 70 hectares for all the other stuff that you need to do in terms of testing, data gathering, etc. And that will be capped to £2 per hectare after 70 hectares. But the biggest introduction really is this sort of social value payment of £107 per hectare for all your farmland, essentially. So that reflects, all the stuff that farmers offer to society, be it sort of tackling climate change, biodiversity, supporting rural communities in the Welsh language, etc. All these things that you can't really buy at the till, and it's actually quite, but they're really important. So that payment sort of reflects what farming and farmers can offer to society. And the mood at the Royal Welsh Show this week is of sort of content, is what I would say. Sort of there'll be
contentment amongst farmers. That's great.
Yeah, there'll be some stakeholders and farmers who feel like they haven't got everything they wanted, but as with any instance in life, you need to compromise, and I think we're in a better place than we were 12 months ago anyway.
So tell me, Rhys, thanks very much for breaking that down. That was really helpful. In terms of applications for the Sustainable Farming Scheme, when can farmers expect to apply? And part of the scheme is actually open already, isn't it, in terms of the organics?
Yeah, so there's a lot of support schemes available at the moment to sort of help that transition into the SFS. So you've got like organic conversion schemes. You've got small grants that can pay for smaller habitats, dry stone wall restoration, hedgerow creation, etc. On your farm to help you try and achieve that 10% habitat, if you like. So the scheme will open next year, and the application process will be from March to the middle of May. So farmers then will have a choice, essentially, that you can go into the Sustainable Farming Scheme next year, or you can remain in the basic payment scheme, albeit at a 60% rate of what it would have been this year. So there's a drop of 40%. There's some in the industry that would challenge that. That's a bit of a cliff edge, a bit too steep. So maybe there will be some wiggle room and compromise there. But hopefully having that sort of tapered approach with the BPS eventually ceasing to exist, I think in 2029, will encourage more farmers to go into the SFS. So it's a big choice for a lot of farmers next year.
So just to be clear, because it seems to me that in contrast to England, both Wales and Scotland are really looking at still continuing to pay farmers, essentially all farmers, on a per hectare basis, providing they're delivering particular outcomes. And this is very much, within the advocacy work that I was doing back in 2017, 2018. And I know that some of the work certainly that Sustainable Food Trust was doing with Wales and with other UK governments was around saying, look, let's focus this. We need change, we need improvement and regeneration on all farms. Let's find ways, let's find those key outcomes that farmers should deliver and then reward farmers for delivering that. And it sounds like that's essentially the approach that Wales is taking.
Yes, you're right. I think the way I look at it in terms of the funding distribution, there will be 70% of the SFS budget that will be allocated towards this sort of universal aid. And I think sort of half of that is that sort of social value payment. So you're talking maybe 35% of the SFS in its entirety being sort of a baseline payment for farmers. And then the other 35% is that sort of the 12 actions, etc., and sort of trying to increase sustainability, to a certain baseline. And then the other 30% is the sort of more ambitious optional and collaborative scheme. So I think that strikes actually quite a sensible balance. But the scheme will evolve over time. There's a bit of pressure, I think, on the industry to demonstrate, that we can do all this, that we can produce food, but looking after biodiversity, climate change, support rural communities, etc. Stuff like access and recreation comes in as well. We're now competing with health, with education, and other government departments, for a slice of the funding. So if the scheme's not delivering on all of these, the Welsh Government will no doubt be re-looking at some of the details to ensure, that we do deliver on all of them. So, let's not rest on our laurels, and demonstrate to the public that we can do all of this.
Rhys, I'm really grateful to you for coming on the programme. I know that you've got a busy schedule at the Royal Welsh and you're off to go and do TV interviews this afternoon and so on. So I'm going to let you escape so that you can go and get ready and do that. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for your knowledge and expertise on that. That's been really fascinating.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. And Joe and Nikki, perhaps Joe first, just really brief reflections on what Rhys was saying there. Any particular thoughts that you want to pick up there?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was a Welsh farmer at this point, I'd be fairly content, I think is the word that Rhys used as well. When you look at let's be honest, the absolute chaos over the border here in England, they're looking at 65% of the old sort of style area payment being retained going forward. Yes, they'll have to do various things in order to achieve that, but that just puts a huge amount of support and stability under future planning. Whereas let's be honest, where we are in England at the moment, we have no idea what the future holds, and it's the roles have been very much reversed. I think again, England thought it was relatively sorted. But now we're on the 5th iteration of the Sustainable Farming Incentive, the 5th rollout of SFI, whereas in Wales, for me, they've taken their time. There's been a lot more vocal opposition to what was going on, but the government does seem to have sat back, listened, and made positive changes. And again, look, not everyone's not going to get what they want. Of course they're not. It's always going to be a compromise, but I think you've got to take the farmers with you, and it seems that they're finally in that position in Wales.
Fantastic. We've got we're 20 minutes in, I think, something like that, and there are still 3 stories that I want to cover before we go to the first break. So that's been great to get some get some of the detail on Wales, and I think that was really important. But just before we move on from this, Nikki, any particular reflections from you and how that links to Scotland as well?
Yeah, I think the idea of a social value payment is really interesting, and that's something as a concept that isn't necessarily brand new. You know, social value as a payment scheme has been applied in other sectors, and I think it's a really interesting one, particularly as Rhys alluded to things like Welsh language, as well as that kind of more understood public good, for example, through ecosystem services. And I think it's important in these conversations to remember, for example, both in Wales and in Scotland, that historically there has really been a lot of support, for example, for red meat production, and recognising as areas that are mostly identified as, well, historically as less favoured areas, that there are particular types of farm systems that have had committed government support historically, even if in some instances they weren't necessarily considered to be as viable or make economic sense, particularly if they were delivered in a way that came out of the kind of 1980s knowledge transfer approaches. So I think there is something there about recognising the kind of intrinsic value that farm systems have. I'm not sure whether that allows then space for ambition and change, because it kind of says, you know, we recognize you as you are, and so here's some payment to do that. I just hope that alongside that, absolute clarity about what that social value is and how it isn't static, and it's something that can improve and change over time, because actually what we're going to need is not just kind of climate mitigation, which a lot of focus has been on. It's about adaptation, resilience, and social resilience. And so I just hope that that social value payment is able to adapt and change as we need it to do in the future.
Fantastic. We're going to come back to Scotland in just a moment, but let's go via England. And Joe, I wonder if you could just really briefly update us with what's happening with inheritance tax in England and the remarkably tone-deaf post that you found on LinkedIn yesterday.
Yeah, no. So the draft legislation has been laid by government leading into the finance bill this autumn regarding inheritance tax issue, which I won't overhash what that means, but ultimately the government has not altered at all. It's exactly the same position it took in October. So, despite all the evidence, all the industry groups, all the experts, all the farmers, the Westminster committees calling it out, the government, or Treasury, let's be honest, has decided that it is just going to press on exactly as it was with its inheritance tax plans. And in fact,
not only that it's going to press on, but that it's really proud of it.
Really proud of it. They've given the chap who came up with the plan and modelled the plan to the extent that they've modelled it at Treasury has just been awarded. Apparently, there is an award within HMRC called Expert of the Year, and this chap posted him on LinkedIn holding said trophy for his work on the farm inheritance tax issue. And I think just basically on this point, look. It's remarkable that after 9 months of what's happened, including tractors clogging up Whitehall, including some incredibly troubling human stories reported in the press, Treasury hasn't even engaged with the issue to the extent that it has developed any hint of self-awareness on this issue. We are so far from having any action on this that Treasury is literally proud of what it is doing, and it is handing out trophies for it. So for me, that is incredibly concerning, just as an indication of the power of government to ride roughshod over evidence and the human experience.
When you sent this to me last night, I kind of assumed that it was satire, that somebody had created a trope that they were sending round, and that this person was a fake AI creation. And I went and checked on LinkedIn, and as you say, this chap is their Expert of the Year for his work on inheritance tax, which, as you say, it's just tone deaf at the best. Nikki, I'm going to come to you because I wonder if we've been talking about inheritance tax quite a lot on the podcast, and my guess is that you don't necessarily share the same level of concern about the inheritance tax issue.
Well, what I would say is that it doesn't affect me personally. As an individual, I'm a first generation farmer. I run a business that doesn't rely on me having to inherit it at any point in the future. I also don't have children. So in terms of how my business strategy has been developed, it's about, we start a business and then we have an exit strategy at a point, and that has been very much always on a personal level, kind of how we've taken our decisions. I think that it's been a really interesting period of time, and I think that there have been strong divisions particularly between the owned and tenanted sectors that have been growing, which have become quite clear to me, in terms of tenants saying, well, we're having to make these payments all the time anyway, because as a tenant, you have to pay your rent. So when, for example, owned farms have been saying we couldn't possibly make these additional payments. So there's definitely been some interesting and probably previously kind of hidden sort of differences there and splits there in the sector. I also think what this has done is create opportunity for discussion about succession. And so I've been hearing more and more people having those conversations, thinking about how their businesses are structured. What has been really fascinating to me, though, actually, has been thinking about how there is a lack of additional support around some of those other services, like the financial sector, to support alternative models of farm business management. So, for example, as it currently stands, there's a very small number of banks that will offer partnerships that aren't individual people, but are partnerships between businesses, for example, a bank account. And so actually, as we start to see farms that are maybe wanting to change structure, to think differently about how their business is developed, we are lacking some of that additional infrastructure to enable that to happen. And we're also lacking some of the skills and knowledge from farm businesses around how to manage their accounts and their finances if they're in a different structure. So, if this is going to be pressed ahead with, and it certainly looks like that is the case, there is a massive need for additional support from organisations who serve farm businesses in terms of making sure they have the products and the goods available to serve a different structure of business, but also for farmers to have additional knowledge exchange opportunities to learn more about different structures and to potentially have some funding to support that, because this is expensive. Having just developed a farm partnership agreement with a landowner, it's cost us a lot of money in legal fees, it's costing us a lot of financial strain in terms of our accountant and all of those other kind of costs that just have to be wrapped up in our overheads. And I think that that's something that has been underassumed here, one would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting perspective and really helpful. Just staying in Scotland, the Scottish Agroecology Partnership fears new capital fund will entrench inequality. That was the headline that we had on 8.9. So from today, farmers and crofters in Scotland will be able to benefit from a 14 million capital fund to invest in items to align their operations with one or more objectives of the new agricultural policy framework in terms of environmental outcomes or financial viability. This is a real sort of cup half full story, Nikki, because the Agroecology Partnership says while the fund has been welcomed in principle, the partnership says that questionable choices have been made by the government in terms of equity and the sustainability of the funding. Do you share their concerns?
Well, I have to say that Pasture for Life, who I work for, is a member of the Scottish Agroecology Partnership. And so having spoken to colleagues here in Scotland about this, I definitely recognise some of the issues that they have raised, one of them being that basically the bigger the farm, the more money you get. However, one could argue that it's difficult to spend as much money on a smaller farm than it is on a bigger farm. For example, let's say you're going to buy some handling equipment. On a small farm, you're going to have a smaller herd. You might not need as much equipment as if you're on a much bigger farm. So I can totally understand the justification for a smaller amount being made available to smaller holdings. There definitely are challenges around issues relating to the kind of market gardeners out there unable to access this payment. My biggest concern is that this capital payment is only available to those farms who have submitted and claimed basic payment through their single application form this year. So if you are, for example, a new entrant who doesn't have basic payment entitlements, you don't have maybe a fixed land holding, you aren't claiming those payments, you are then ineligible to claim the capital fund. So I know of a number of new entrants who are on various grazing licenses, who maybe are on access arrangements with landowners that is not a formal tenancy, it's not owned land, they don't submit a single application form to claim payment, and as such they are totally unable to and are ineligible for this fund. And for me, that really is concerning. We desperately need new people coming into the sector with creative business ideas. And linking back to what we were talking about earlier around inheritance tax, we need alternative business models. And yet if we have policy and capital funds that are entirely based around old ways of doing things and old business structures where there is an assumption that you own entitlements attached to a tenancy or land ownership, and only that is the thing that opens the door, then for me that is an entrenchment of inequality, because it refuses to accept that there are different ways of doing things, and actually it will put people off, because in the future, why would you set up as a new entrant trying to go into an arrangement that's more creative and more flexible if you know it's going to prohibit you from having access to future grant schemes?
Fantastic. And forgive me that I'm not going to dwell on that for any longer, because we did spend quite a lot of time on the Welsh Sustainable Farming Scheme to begin with, and there are still a couple of stories that I want to go on to. And this one I think is really interesting. It's quite meaty really, in terms of the way that land is managed and the way that sheep are farmed in particular within the UK. And our headline on 8.9 was NSA, that's the National Sheep Association, working to balance sheep grazing with improved ecology. Now, this was a response from the NSA following a Guardian article by environmentalist Chris Packham. And to completely, I don't know how many people this is going to upset, but I rather love Chris Packham. I think he is a fantastic naturalist. I think he's a really interesting person and does some really good campaigning at the same. And he does raise and challenge us on some difficult questions. I'm not sure that he's quite got it right on this though, and so this is why I wanted to drill into it a bit more. Clearly, there are problems on Dartmoor, on the Dartmoor Commons, but the question is more about the role of sheep in the landscape and regeneration more broadly. So this was a story where Chris was complaining that sheep are destroying Britain's upland habitats, which is a story, it's a trope that we hear on a regular basis. And the NSA says that it accepts that Britain's uplands face many challenges, but has said that it's simply incorrect to blame sheep or upland farming more broadly as the root cause of this. And Phil Stocker, the chief executive of the NSA, said that protected site condition actually is a complex issue, with many of them many protected sites continuing to be in unfavourable conditions. But this isn't something that can simply be addressed by reducing stock numbers. And this is the key paragraph, I suppose, in the article, which is site condition is designated in designated protected areas is influenced by a multitude of factors, and reducing grazing levels alone, a strategy driven by environmental schemes over the last 20 years, has not yielded the improvements in ecological recovery that many expected. In fact, evidence shows that inadequate grazing, whether from sheep, cattle or ponies, has often allowed damaging encroachment by bracken gorse and purple moorgrass, degrading biodiversity, peatland and habitat quality. Now, Nikki, we know that cattle are an essential part of regeneration, but that there are good cattle systems and there are bad cattle systems. Is the same true with sheep?
Yeah, I would push back on that, Finlo, and I'd say grazing livestock are critical to regenerative systems. I've seen, as you point out, horrendous cattle management, amazing cattle management, and the same can be said for sheep. And I've even, you see it on one farm. You may see sheep being managed really well on some areas of a farm, and then in other areas, because of other infrastructure challenges, time constraints, other logistic issues, that the sheep are managed not so well. And I really, really kind of feel it's important that we get away from trying to take single lens approaches to any of the complexity of issues that we see around farm systems, around ecology and around ecosystem management. Removing sheep from a particular area is going to change the landscape, absolutely. But I think it depends on what do we want that landscape to do. And so we are never ever clear enough about what we actually want our management to aim towards. What we all get caught up in is the argument of whether sheep are good or bad, whether cattle should exist or not, and how we should be having certain numbers of animals. But actually, when you start delving into understanding ruminant behaviour and their relationship with grasslands, you start to understand it's not how many animals. The critical factor is time, not the number, and that relates to both the time allocation those animals have in terms of exposure to that ecosystem, but also the allocation of time to enable for rest, to enable recovery of that grassland ecosystem. So this isn't about, and actually what I would say is I feel many conservationists are still stuck in this thing about it's the number of animals that's important, when we know increasingly that it is about this management of exposure. It's about the time that we use to create impact, grazing impact, but then also to create recovery. So for me, this is a non-argument. It's not about should there be sheep there or not. It's about how do we give farmers the tools, the knowledge, the skills to manage livestock to achieve the outcomes and the management aims that have been determined for that particular area of ground. Now, determining those management outcomes might be a complex thing because it's probably going to involve a number of stakeholders. And if you are grazing your livestock on a protected area, on an area with a designation like a SSSI or an SPA or something like that, then yeah, there's going to be a number of stakeholders with a vested interest to make sure that those management outcomes are clearly in alignment with the reason for that designation. But that doesn't mean that we can't manage our animals better. So for me, this is about people, as it always comes down to, and how do we facilitate and enable an engaged conversation about what are we managing for? And at the point when we've identified what we're managing for, and we shouldn't allow folk to say, oh, and that means this sort of grazing management. No. Let's be clear. What's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? And then once we've understood that, how can we go away and learn and develop the skills and the knowledge, and how can we support access to tools that allows farmers to manage those animals in a way that meets those outcomes?
Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of think about the way that designated landscapes, are managed. And I think, part of this is about very often those designations are fairly blunt instruments, and they're not necessarily in the current paradigm. They've been sort of, they're designations that have been drawn up in the last 10, 20, or way sort of older than that in terms of years. And that actually what we want from land management now is quite different than perhaps we wanted 10, 20 years ago. And Cora Cooper, who I spoke to as a sheep farmer in Ayrshire, in relation to another podcast on the lynx. If people want to hear that, then it's going back about 10 or 12, I think, actually, because of the groundswell episodes. It's probably about 20 back now in our lists. But that was a really interesting conversation where she was talking about some of the challenges of managing designated landscapes, and that actually those designations are stopping her from being able to deliver the best ecological outcomes, which is a real challenge. Joe, do you have any particular thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with what Nikki said. I mean, she's more of a subject expert on this than me, but I think that's absolutely right. I find interesting what you said, Finlo, that you thought, generally speaking, Chris Packham was, had good points. I would disagree with you on that. I would say that he's one of those relatively rare figures in public life who is I would say he's not a positive influence on the discussions that we need to have as a society about how we get a more sustainable food system. I know one of your sort of favourites in that regard is people like George Monbiot as well. I don't
you said
think
you didn't
these
want to
people.
mention George Monbiot.
Well, I think he's on my short list of people who I just don't think are useful within these discussions. I think we need to have those kind of reasoned, evidence-based discussions. I mean, what Nikki was just saying, fabulous, right? And I went to an upland farm last week in Cumbria, and they are doing fantastic things. I was actually judging it for the GWCT Schoffel Awards, nature-friendly farming systems. This upland farm, a tenant farmer in the uplands, doing wonderful things. Integrating cattle and sheep, and doing that with wonderful, measurable impacts on soil health, on biodiversity, on that farm, on carbon emissions. It can be done. And again, yeah, Nikki's right. Perhaps let's not split hairs. Absolutely, there are farms which are not doing it as well as they could be doing it. Let's be honest. A lot of that is a slow decline in essentially that connection to the best way of doing things driven by market forces over the last 50 years. And what we need to do is we need to get profitability back into these landscapes. And with that profitability, there comes the ability to manage these landscapes in a sustainable way and to achieve the multiple land use outcomes that Nikki was talking about. The problem isn't it, that we've essentially asked our upland farmers to survive on selling sheep when the cost of shearing the wool clip is actually outweighs the value of the wool. This is a broken economic system. This is why we get bad outcomes. So yeah, just saying, oh, sheep are bad, sheep wrecking our landscape is absolutely crazy. So no, I agree. And it's not the cow, it's the how, all that sort of thing. Absolutely, we can do it. I've seen it. Nikki will have seen it. Philo, I'm sure you've seen places that are managing to achieve all of these outcomes simultaneously and profitably. And we just need to roll out that knowledge and the financial support to enable that to happen.
You see, Joe, you're from, a different generation to me. I grew up with the Really Wild Show, with posters of Chris Packham and Michaela Strachan on the wall of my room, from Top of the Pops magazine and all this kind of thing. And so, I've kind of grown up with them teaching me about ecology.
Indoctrinated from a young age, Finlo.
Indeed. And then, of course, I love watching with the kids things like Spring Watch and Autumn Watch. I completely take your point that it's not always helpful when celebrities say silly things in the media, and I'm not sure the comparison with George Monbiot is entirely fair, because I would say that where George Monbiot was a positive voice 15 years ago, I find it very hard to find a sensible thing that he says at all these days. Where with Chris, at least when you're watching Spring Watch, the amount of knowledge that he has in the subject areas that he's expert in are fantastic. But as you say, let's and actually, beyond that, whether it's George Monbiot or whether it's Chris Packham, when they say silly things, it does give us the chance within the media to talk about these issues in a more nuanced way, to come back to them.
But that
say
so rarely happens. That rarely happens, and you just end up with a balkanization of the. Well, it gives you and I that. We don't see that at the scale that it's needed in the media outlets that are most widely accessed. It just drives binary division and shouting, and that has been so destructive.
Give it a year, and we'll be the most popular podcast in Britain, surely. And then we can have those.
Now Nikki's been on, that's possible.
And there is those conversations.
There is something that I don't know if it's worth just mentioning, but I do think it's really important here. And this is this thing about, Joe, you mentioned profitability as a topic, and often in farming, because we've become so used to, decades of common agricultural policy and being paid to farm, that there's an assumption that profitability means being paid by somebody else to do something, particularly, essentially government, and having that income support to deliver profitability. And something I'm increasingly aware of is farmers not being able to understand their cost of production, particularly in beef and sheep. Now, I'm not saying all farmers, and there are some phenomenally savvy, on it with their numbers, beef and sheep farmers out there, but there are huge numbers of particularly upland farms who don't always fully understand their cost of production, and so sometimes make business decisions that don't make financial sense and also create increased grazing pressure on their landscapes. So I'm going to give you an example of somebody having some animals. Maybe they've bought in some crossbred dairy calves, and they're going to rear them on their farm, and they've decided that they're going to then sell them as they get a bit older as store animals. And because they are so used to just making silage and conserving forage, and then as a result of that requiring the muck to go back onto those fields, they're going to keep those animals, those calves, they're going to grow them on a store, keep them over winter, and they might even keep them for a second winter. And when challenged about, but you obviously get a higher payment for them in the spring and selling them store in the spring, I get that, but does that higher payment offset the wintering cost? Many of them can't tell you. And if you're asking about, for example, sheep, taking weaning lambs, so taking the lambs off their mothers, weaning them, and then getting them to a point where they want to put them to market, either store or finishing through as fat. Not enough farmers, in my view, are doing the maths to work out the most profitable time to do that. And all of this then snowballs into this issue of there being animals on farm that aren't necessarily generating a profit. Actually, what they're doing is costing the farmer money. And then this view from others externally that there are too many animals in the system at any one time. So I genuinely believe that if we were able to create mind capacity for many of these farmers to understand their cost of production. And that doesn't mean sending them on a how to do farm business accounting course. It's actually about really going through the nuts and bolts of their business on a very one-to-one basis and giving very specific advice to help them make better decisions. That, for me, I think would then snowball to see ecological shifts, economic change, as well as them just feeling like they've got more control, which would then hopefully start to see mental health issues that we see in the sector changing as well. So we are very quick to simplify these challenges, but actually I really do feel that this more holistic, complex approach to understanding some of the challenges facing farmers could have multiple wins if we were able to get an intervention right.
And
it was,
PFL, I'm sure, would talk about maximum sustainable output, wouldn't you, Nikki?
Yeah.
Exactly what you've just talked about there. The most number of something doesn't have to mean the most profitable, and in fact, oftentimes does not. So, what can your
Absolutely.
farm actually sustain in an economic fashion? And yeah, I would encourage people to go away and look at that maximum sustainable output model. I think there's a book recently come out. Your chair has written a foreword for it, The Profitable Farm, I think it's called, and it is just worth having getting your head around that concept, and it might help to sort of start the decision-making process around exactly those issues you're talking about there. Because I agree, Nikki, look, I mean, some of the sectors of the agricultural sector here in the UK are some of the most efficient in the world, but I think it would be difficult to argue that some of our red meat producers especially are in that number, and I think there is a huge amount of opportunity cost in the way that, and I would include my own historic, farm grazing in this. There is no way in hell that we were doing what we were doing as efficiently as we could possibly have been doing it, and we weren't doing the figures. And absolutely, so yeah, I think there is a huge opportunity to increase the efficiency and even potentially the output of the red meat sector here in the UK. Look at the research I think we've talked about before, Finlo, that Rothamsted have done down at Northwick, down in Devon, I think, where by adopting a more regenerative strategy, they actually increased the amount of livestock that they could carry on their land and their profitability. So we don't have to be talking about less. We could be talking about more, but better. And I know you like that phrase, Finlo, more and better. It is achievable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was an article that I was going to talk about before we went to the break, but I'm not now because I don't think we've got time. But this was about the Wildlife Trust's new vision to deliver farm resilience in the face of ecological crisis. We're not going to talk about that, but if people want to hear more about it and haven't yet heard the interview with Vicky Hurd, then again, just sort of skip back 5 or 6 episodes in your Farmgate feed, and you'll find a conversation with Vicky Hurd from the Wildlife Trust talking about that. But one of the things in there, in terms of their key transformations, they were talking about adopting nature positive and climate neutral diets. And I think that's a really interesting shift, because it's not about eating less meat and dairy. It's about recognizing that actually sometimes the most climate neutral diets or nature positive diets might actually mean more. So it's working out, again, putting nuance into that conversation. And again, just sort of finally, before we go there, before we go to a break, the thing that we can do when people like celebrities say silly things and point to the bad is talk loudly about the good. And I think that's what we've been able to do today. We've been able to bring some nuance to the conversation. We've been able to talk about the good. And when it comes to sheep, it's about finding the best systems. It's about sharing best practice, ensuring that farmers are able to listen and perhaps prepared to change some of their sort of approaches to set stocking, and that we start talking to ecologists about designations and how they work. It's about trying to get more people around the table. And perhaps this is something that, within Farmgate, that we might try and do a little bit in the future, that we want to address that whole issue of sheep and ecology. And that means talking to ecologists as well as sheep farmers and trying to make sure that there is a better understanding on both sides of what good actually looks like. Look, let's take a break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about Joe and Nikki's sort of different routes into regeneration. There we go. There's some music and a little bit of a break. And welcome back. So, Nikki, let's talk for the rest of the programme about regen farming, about your approach and Joe's approach, and how they're different, and whether they're, how you can reconcile those differences in terms of both being part of this regenerative and agroecological movement that we have. And should we start just by kind of talking about how you became a regenerative farmer? Have you always been regen?
Yeah, I guess, well, I used to have horses, and I grew up with horses as a kid. And when I think back to what some of our fields look like, I absolutely shudder. So, yeah, I haven't kind of been, I didn't, as a child, kind of run around skipping through lovely tall grass grazing meadows, getting very excited about regen ag. That definitely wasn't the case. And so I've done my fair share of ecological damage, one might say, with copious amounts of wormer going into horses and pretty poorly set stock paddocks. But I was very much inspired by a good friend of mine who was a farm manager at the agricultural college where I was head of department for land-based studies. And he was all about forage and grass and getting milk from forage. And it really was from a financial perspective that he was kind of interested in that. And that's what piqued my interest. And then when we ended up farming in our own right, it was a result of learning about holistic management, meeting Rob Havard, who is now a good friend and who we work with as part of a native Angus breeding program, and just meeting people who spoke sense and who talked about landscapes and systems in a way that resonated with us. We didn't come into farming because we wanted to be farmers. We came into farming because we wanted to manage landscapes and produce good food. And so I think that sometimes is a pathway or an entryway in, that it's not about who you are as a person, but it's about what you do, what you're able to produce and what you're able to, the impact that you're able to have. And increasingly through my own work, I've recognized that, there are different types of people, and people want to be farmers, and there are people who want to manage landscapes or produce food. And some people want to be all three, but actually I think that there's often a difference about how you think of yourself, either what you are or what you do, and that I think is something maybe that has become clearer to me, that's how we became in our farm system very much focused on holistic management, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, all those buzzwords that people kind of shake their heads about and say, oh, well, I don't like describing myself as this, but then go on to talk about their system, which is clearly regenerative or agroecological. So I don't want to shy away from those words. I think they're useful. They help us to frame what we do and why we do it. And yeah, that approach to us just makes sense. It's just something that has just absolutely, both financially and ecologically, made absolute sense to us in the development of our business.
And Joe, this is quite different to your route into regen, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my actual farming, my personal farming career has been entirely highly conventional. Just towards the tail end of being at my family farm, and I left there now 4.5 years ago, I just started to get into being able to implement a few really basic things that you might consider to be more sustainable, more regenerative, whatever you want to call it. But really the majority of my experience of it is passive, if you like, at the Allerton Project, and sort of moving through the industry more widely in the last 4 or 5 years. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, I started to notice things on my farm that didn't seem right. I'd kind of seen them for years, decades, but never really. I started to put a few things together, and I think that came about as a result of perhaps a sort of a naturally inquisitive mind, which had been very much, from a farming perspective, kept in a very tight box by the farming environment I was in at the time, which was very, very conventional. And then, being on social media, reading the farming press, seeing things that Pasture for Life or whatever we're putting out, and then just starting to make connections. Why is there 3 foot of soil at the base of this slope against a dry stone wall, this cultivated arable field? That shouldn't be there, right? And just then you start to think, and then yeah, absolutely. So for me, I come from a very conventional background, which I think helps me in my work at the Allerton Project to talk to people about that journey that we as an industry kind of need to make in this regard.
Nikki, I would probably sort of characterize your approach to regen and your voice within the regenerative movement as being sort of very much within the sort of the deep green sort of set. You're very regenerative. You have a really good understanding of the various different processes and systems and pillars of regenerative agriculture, where Joe has sort of come in from a mainstream end, a conventional end, and he's increasingly found that in order to deliver resilience within his system, there is a need to make this change. And surely Joe is precisely the kind of person that we need to bring into the movement. And his journey into it actually is really fascinating and something that we need to replicate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've definitely been guilty of being a bit of a regen gatekeeper historically, particularly on social media, and kind of getting...
Just describe that term for me.
Well, I guess kind of, being very judgmental and judging who I determine to be regenerative or not. And who the hell am I to say that? But I think that's because I'm a person of extremes. I'm very open about the fact I have ADHD, and often that means that kind of one symptomatic behavior of that is that you kind of have extremes of feeling about things. And so I've often found it very difficult. I'm an all-in kind of person. I'm either fully in or I'm not engaged. And so it's been very difficult for me, I think, to kind of understand, and also the complexities of multi-generational farming, people having different perspectives, different viewpoints, financial lock-in to particular systems. This stuff is really, really complex and difficult, and often complicated further by human emotion, engagement, challenges, all of that kind of stuff. So I definitely have been on a learning journey myself. Probably almost, in direct correlation to the learning journey many farmers have had to become more regenerative. I've definitely been on a journey to better learn and understand other farmers. And a big part of that has been going to spend time on what you might call conventional farms or very intensive farms, to learn from those farmers about why they do what they do, how they view their farms. I'm not really interested in what they think about my farm. I want to know what they think about their farm and what they're doing, and learn from them. So I was recently on another podcast where I was asked, what's like the best bit of advice you've ever been given? And I sort of struggled because I'm very forgetful and I forget all the advice I'm ever given, which is why I'm probably kind of struggling my way through life. But the one that I came up with was this idea of start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can, which is not how I behave and it's not how I think. I'm like all in or nothing. But actually, as a phrase, I would love to be more accepting of that kind of way of doing things. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, because actually, when we are facing multiple crises as humanity, it's better than nothing. So I think that, any farmer, and I also, we all just need to be kinder to each other. And I think I definitely was challenging people far too much to be more regenerative. You've got to be more regenerative, because I felt there was an urgency. But actually, it's about going and identifying what are the wins people are having on their farms, what are the things that are going well, what would they like to see different, what would they like to do differently, how can we help them to make those shifts. And I think within Pasture for Life particularly, we've really kind of switched to a sense of meeting people where they are and helping them get to where they want to be, rather than just saying everyone should be pasture fed. We know that isn't necessarily viable for every farm as they stand at the moment. So how can we meet people where they are, give them opportunities to pique their curiosity for doing things in a different way, and to create the tools, the community around them to help them make any shifts that they wish to take, and find ways of learning from mistakes that they've made and that we've all made together.
Nikki, you described yourself as being a person of extremes, and I wonder, 5, 7, 8 years ago, when regenerative agriculture was still a relatively new conversation in the UK, whether there was a need at that point to sort of describe the extremes, to be really clear about what regen was in that sort of, deep green way, in order to start to build that movement. But of course, that movement has changed in the same way that you say that you've been learning. The movement has become much more broad, many more people involved in it. It would be hard to be a farmer in Britain and not have heard of regenerative agriculture at the moment. So do you think that there is a degree to which the language that we use around regen needed to change and needs to be different now to the language that it was then? Or is there still a place for those people to really describe what it is in its kind of microcosmic essence, and those, who are sort of taking that more gradual journey?
As a social scientist, I feel like I should say, yes, we need lots of people to talk about it and to, debate endlessly over terminology. As a pragmatist, absolutely not. We just need to get on and do this stuff. And it's increasingly frustrating for me, with a foot in a camp of academia and one in practical farming, that I speak to researchers all the time who tell me that no one really understands what regenerative agriculture is, yet I could happily present them with 300 farmers who could tell you this is what regen ag is. And so I have this real frustration about that. So, would love to see more academic acceptance of what's going on. And I think that the debate that they're driving actually is probably unhelpful, and we just need to see good positive action.
Yeah, positive action on the ground. Joe, you came to regen, I think it's fair to say, despite the regen movement. What was it that kind of put you off the regen movement and made you a bit sort of reluctant to enter that world? And what was it that finally, broke down those barriers for you? And how do you feel about it now?
Well, I guess
it's
with
a good
respect,
therapy session, isn't it?
We'll see. I mean, 5 years ago, I do remember there were several occasions, Nikki, where yes, I was on the receiving end of your displeasure on social media, and yeah, there were at that time, and I don't know whether it has changed, because I think I see less of it now, or maybe I just don't get picked on as much. there was a lot of people who were, I feel, and I think we've talked about this before, Finlo, being very prescriptive as to what they thought, sustainable agriculture looked like, and it did put me off. I mean, I remember quite clearly, and I don't have a very good memory, several sort of online conversations with people where I was literally saying, "You are literally putting me off the idea of even trying this because you are just being so horrible." And that's not Nikki I'm talking about here. And yeah, I'm on record as writing and saying things about how this is all nonsense, and we have to cling on and plow every field every year for all the all these good reasons. And frankly, my approach to agriculture these days, it's I don't know, it's very pragmatic, it's very flexible, but I can see how the stuff that I used to do was ultimately unsustainable in the medium to long term. It might have been very successful financially and all the rest of it for decades, but it clearly was running out of steam and is running out of steam. However, the reality of today is that the market economic conditions, the system that we live in, the weather that we're experiencing actually means that some of the stuff that I would love to see being done more is actually becoming more challenging, in my view. Again, we've talked about before, Finlo, here, that really heavy land that we've got here at the Allerton Project. We're having to do more cultivations than we have done historically for all manner of reasons. And we have to be flexible enough to say, look, you can either stay in business or you can be dogmatic about things. And I think that dogmatism that we see from certain parts of the industry still, I think that is quite challenging for most people to understand. Like, you have to change as the evidence changes, you have to change as the conditions change. And this isn't to say that if we hadn't been doing 100% pure regen 30 years ago, we wouldn't be all in a much better place today. The challenge is some of these things that we're trying to implement, especially in an annual cropping system, are so bloody hard when we're in the teeth of extreme climate change. And that means you have to sometimes flip a coin between, do I do what I know is right in the long term, or do I do what I think will make me still in business next year? And that's the fundamental tragedy of where we are, that we're trying to implement these changes today and not 20 years ago, when it frankly would have been a damn sight easier.
Let's come on to different systems and delivering regeneration in different systems perhaps in just a moment, because I think that's a really important part of the conversation. But let's go back to that sort of idea of dogmatism and the way that dogmatism can put people off, because you mentioned social media there, and so I wonder if it's actually not so much about the regen movement itself, and it's more about the role of social media and how people interact on social media, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the health service or football or regenerative agriculture. There is an awful lot of dogmatism on social media and a lot of angry people who really take it out on each other. And if that was happening in, if those people met in person, I wonder if those conversations would happen in the same way. And I'm kind of going back to, Groundswell 2 or 3 weeks ago, where I didn't come across any of that dogmatism. All of the conversations, all of the panels, all of the conversations that I heard around the field there, they were nuanced. They were much kinder. They were the kind of conversations that you would expect human beings to have. So is it less about, is it more about how we have those conversations and where we have those conversations? And I wonder, Joe, just before I go back to Nikki on this, whether you feel that there has been a growing up within the movement, and whether actually, if I'd been at Groundswell 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been more dogmatic. Do you think that nuance has just naturally occurred?
I think so. I think again, you're looking at some of the really leading proponents of regenerative practices who are openly saying, "Look, I'm doing things differently today than I was 5 years ago. I've learned. I've realized that there's an extent to which I can push certain things, which isn't to say they're wrong. It just means that they need tweaking, they need nuance applying to them." And I think we're seeing more of that. Our research here at the Allerton Project demonstrates again that flexibility is key. And I think more and more people are realizing that. More and more people are coming on board with the concept of regenerative agriculture, who would have previously thought it was a complete anathema. If you drive around the countryside today, you will see, and you know what you're looking for, before, there is a huge amount of positive change happening out there in the landscape. Of course, there's a long way to go. But again, as you said, Finlo, 5 to 8 years ago, very few people were talking about this. Today, it is the major point of conversation. And what are we expecting from the 120 odd thousand farm businesses here in the UK, to change overnight? That's not the way it works. So I'm really positive about the direction of travel that we've been going in. And yeah, if someone like me can flip on a sixpence almost, then there's hope for anyone, right? So yeah, we've just got to keep the momentum behind this. And yeah, whatever the label you want to slap on it, I don't care. It's just we need to keep that positive direction of travel towards more, more nature and climate-friendly farming practices.
I think the point that Joe made about it would be much easier to have done this 20 years ago is really key. And actually trying to make change now whilst we are in climate volatility and weather patterns are changing on an annual basis is really difficult, because what that then means is when it doesn't go well, quite often the farmer will say, well, I tried that regenerative nonsense and it didn't work because everything went wrong. But it might have been at that point in time in those conditions. And if you're just trying to test something, we've probably all experienced, you try something new, it doesn't go so well, you really beat yourself up about it and you go, well, I'm never doing that again. Or if you're of a certain disposition, it really makes you bloody minded and you want to get on and try it and do it again and again. Again, I think this comes back to some of the things I was talking about earlier, this idea of, a lack of system understanding from many farmers, because they just haven't had the headspace and they've been pushed by external actors to produce at any cost. And actually, if they were able to understand financial, ecological and social implications of making a change 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and they had confidence to forecast, I think they would be in a much better position and a much better situation. So being able to set out from a financial perspective, longer term forecasting, making an assessment and a kind of educated forecast or educated assessment about what could change, what the impact could be, I think that would really help farmers to make change and actually be able to really interrogate, did I make the right decision here? Did I make the wrong decision? How do I do it slightly differently next time while still aiming towards these particular principles or goals? So again, it comes back to the kind of social implications of decision making, management frameworks, all of that sort of stuff, rather than does no-till work on my farm or not? And I think that's what we need to zoom out from, is we need to think more in terms of systems and decision making.
Yeah, and I wonder, Joe, and I know that we need to wrap this up to an extent. We need to sort of finish in the next few minutes. But I'm just wondering if we could look at this idea of systems thinking versus, kind of slightly more painting by numbers approach, a more functional approach, because of course that's a big challenge. An awful lot of farmers have been, for many, many years, farmers have been doing the things that they've been told to do. There has been a relatively prescriptive approach to the way that people farm, and they're not used to system thinking. So I guess the question, Nikki, briefly is, does everybody need to become a systems thinker, or is it okay that some farmers will come to regenerative agriculture just applying some of the practices that they've heard about?
I personally don't think that practices make a regenerative farmer. Regenerative farming and agriculture is about management in alignment with principles. And sometimes the toolbox that you need to rely on will include things that some people might not think are regenerative. And I think if we look at John Pawsey and some of the work that he's been doing over the last decades of, really going towards regenerative and then realizing actually there is a time and a place to use a plough, shallow plough, for example, but when he's able to stand back and look over that 5-10 year period ahead of him, he knows the impact that's going to have because he's been able to be very pragmatic about the approach. And this doesn't mean that you can call yourself regenerative and then do stuff that isn't. It's about being able to articulate the overall system and how the decisions that you're making lead you to the management outcomes you want to get to, in alignment with regenerative principles, applying the most appropriate tool in the toolkit at that time. The complexity of that inevitably leads you to be a systems thinker. So I think that, you kind of, this is a bit of the you're either in or you're out, is actually you can't kind of half-ass regen. You just need to think about what are the principles, what are the tools I'm going to use, what are my management outcomes, what's the context for me, and how am I going to get there? And it's that complexity of thinking that enables us to deliver regenerative systems, because actually that's what Regen Ag is about. It's about ecosystems. It's about a regenerative system, not a regenerative individual practice, field or person.
And just finally, the sort of final subject to sort of cover on this, I suppose, is about those different sorts of systems and the way in which, if you're an arable farmer, if you're a root vegetable farmer, it's much more difficult to get to a regenerative place than it is if you're a ruminant farmer. And, cattle are relatively straightforward in terms of regenerative agriculture to get those outcomes that we want. But when you're ploughing, when you're potentially having to use chemicals still within your system, that's a very different thing, Nikki.
Yeah, as a suckler beef producer, I hold my hands up and say I have the easiest job of any of us in terms of producing food regeneratively. It really isn't. It isn't complicated. You can do it very easily. But I absolutely agree. Producing field scale parsnips, carrots, potatoes, very, very difficult to kind of align that with regenerative principles. So, this comes back to things like scale. How do we support market gardeners who can produce root crops on a smaller scale? How does that then tie into post-farm gate food supply? This is where we shift from regenerative to agroecological, because we're thinking about the ecosystem of the entire, or the ecology of the entire food system, which is probably a conversation for another day, given that we need to wrap up. But yeah, absolutely. The complexity and the challenges on different types of farm systems are going to make this more or less easy for different individuals to engage with.
And Joe, perhaps some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, this is the fundamental issue is, if we're talking about systems, it's not just the system on the individual farm. It is the system, as I think Nikki has just brought out there, on the entire food system, on society, linking health with, health with food production, with migration, with all these different issues, and that is a more fundamental conversation that we need to have as a society, and that's why I do continue to be, frankly, dismayed by the quality of the conversation that we're having in the mainstream around this. The distance we still are from, as a country, as a society, putting together a comprehensive vision of how we can produce that healthy food, get it to people in sufficient quantities at a good price, and have profitability at the farm gate. I frankly think we're nowhere on that still, sort of at the macro level. It's not good enough for an individual farmer to say, I'm going to do everything I can to be regenerative, because if that commodity is just going into a bulk commodity pit, as has been the case for the last 70 years, and is increasingly the case, not decreasingly the case. Nikki talks about agroecological food systems. Fantastic. I used to think it was madness and silliness. Now I see it makes sense. It makes sense to have that kind of more decentralized food system. The problem is, and look at the government's food strategy. The government's just released a sort of an initial outline of its food strategy. It's very difficult to disagree with anything it's got in there. It seems incredibly ambitious. It is doing absolutely nothing to make any of that actually happen. Now we have to move away from, from positive press releases to actually putting in concrete and positive and long-lasting and long-term change on the ground. We need to do that now. We can't just keep talking about it.
Fantastic. Thank you both. That's been really interesting. And Nikki, thank you so much for coming on the programme and giving us the benefit of your expertise and knowledge, across a range of different issues there. And it's been really interesting. We didn't finish a conversation. We started a conversation really there about the differences in approaches to regen and how we sort of move forward with it. But I think that the things that you were both saying there were really interesting in your different approaches and the way in which there is connectivity between the two of you. There are places where there is strong agreement, much as there is other nuance that needs to be worked through. So I want to thank our guests, Nikki Yoxall from Pasture for Life and Rhys Evans from the Nature Friendly Farming Network in Wales. Next week on Farmgate, I'll be finding out how nature is being given a voice in flood mitigation decisions in Wales. And then the following week, I'll be talking to the fabulous Andy Cato about his life, his stumbling entry into French farming, and his roaring success back in the UK with Wild Farmed. As ever, there's just so much in our back catalogue. Whether you're harvesting, travelling, or just lying on the beach, we've got hundreds of hours of fascinating conversations for you to work through. And if you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, make a comment, review us, and share our links. It all really helps to build the Farmgate listening family. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment partnership, Agrolo and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain.
I've been Nikki Yoxall.
And I've been Joe Stanley.
Bye for now.